During the civil wars in Sudan, an estimated 4 million people fled southern Sudan. From the southern areas, people fled to the neighboring countries of Uganda and Kenya, while most people living in states near the border with northern Sudan fled to Khartoum. Since the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005, the security situation has improved and over 2.7 million people have returned. Following the independence of the Republic of South Sudan on the 9th of July in 2011, those South Sudanese remaining in Sudan were given a transition period of 8 months to either regularize their stay in Sudan or return to South Sudan. Since the beginning of the process, returns have been taking place by train, air, river and road. Over the past year, South Sudanese nationals have returned spontaneously and through organized movements to South Sudan. However, insecurity and recent escalation in tensions between the two countries have drastically reduced return options, with the closure of many routes. As a result, the majority of returnees find themselves stranded at or near entry points.
We're here at the transit site for returnees that we established at the beginning of May, or mid-May, for returnees being airlifted from Kosti. In total, close to 12,000 individuals were repatriated by IOM. The original idea was for IOM to repatriate this caseload by barge. Barge operations. Kosti is sitting on the Nile, close enough to the South Sudanese border, and so the most logical and straightforward way to move people down into South Sudan was by barge. The only alternative we were able to identify to meet the urgent requirements to repatriate this group was by air, hence the airlift, which was a very specific, exceptional set of measures that were put together by IOM, which we would not normally do.
IOM completed a total of 79 flights from Khartoum to Juba since the airlifting operation began on 14th of May 2012. Over 11,813 returnees have been airlifted to Juba. IOM and UNHCR teams were mobilized to meet the returnees as they arrived at Juba International Airport. Passenger manifests were sent ahead of the flight so that teams could prepare to receive returnees with special needs. Medical teams were on hand to provide emergency medical assistance. It was initially planned to conduct routine immunizations upon arrival, but unfortunately there weren't any health facilities at the airport, and vaccinations were creating bottlenecks. From the second day, all passengers were moved to the transit site and vaccinated upon arrival in a dedicated tent. All new arrivals were transported to a temporary transit site established on the grounds of the National Teachers Training Institute, 13 kilometers outside of Juba. IOM and UNHCR, in partnership with the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs and Disaster Management, were responsible for managing the transit site.
Well, I think we were all taken by surprise by the turn of events in White Nile State, where government authorities, humanitarian stakeholders here, and the same happened in Khartoum. And so we became completely dependent on the supports and the understanding of government authorities here to quickly identify a site that could accommodate a sufficient number of people. So the government played a critical role in identifying first this location as a suitable site to receive people, where conditions would be met in terms of access to water, in terms of security, and then securing the necessary authorizations for us to be able to establish the temporary site here.
It was important to work from the beginning on the site plan. This helps to position the different facilities in order to ease access to each of them, to consider from the beginning the gender issues, and to facilitate the coordination between actors. Returnees were arriving quickly and in large numbers. It was necessary to ensure that shelter was erected before they arrived on site. IOM paid labourers according to the number of tents they set up. While this method had labourers eager to work quickly, it was important to make sure that there was an IOM staff familiar with site planning, supervising, to ensure that tents were set up in the correct locations. It was faster to erect family-sized tents than it was to erect the longhouses. It was necessary to define space to set up both types of shelter. The tents were not 100% waterproof, and it was necessary to place plastic sheets over the tents. IOM approached the chiefs who mobilized some youth, so the entire distribution was completed within a couple of hours after the rain had begun. Upon arrival at the transit site, returnees were registered by IOM for tracking purposes, registered by a cross for food tokens, and provided with NFIs by the NFI cluster of South Sudan.
Normally the cluster will target response according to need and vulnerability, but in this case, because the returnees were being flown from Kosti with very few possessions and they were going to need to stay at the camp for a period of time with no belongings, we conducted a blanket distribution to all arrivals, with NFI distributed on the basis of household size. So the larger families received additional NFI to ensure they had sufficient to cover their needs.
Teams had to deal with arguments that broke out between family members that had travelled on the same voluntary return form but did not want to share NFI items. When shelter was set up at the site, communal tents were set up to receive late arrivals of returnees and also to be able to accommodate everyone in the first nights before allocating family tents in the following days. Camp management worked closely with the traditional chiefs to allocate shelter. The chiefs were responsible for directing new arrivals to shelter and were quick to resolve any issues that arose. One of the challenges involved having limited family-sized tents, so later arrivals had to share space in the communal tents and longhouses. Specific tents were allocated for single or unmarried men. It was necessary to have the presence of the South Sudan police services to ensure that the luggage distribution was orderly. Initially, the distribution happened off the back of a truck, but this was difficult to control. The next step was to isolate a venue where the luggage could be lined up. Small groups of returnees were allowed to enter the longhouse at one time to identify their luggage. The luggage tags had to correspond to the VRF bracelet, or returnees had to identify an item in their luggage, which was then checked by staff. Most of the challenges involving luggage concerned unidentified lost luggage.
Some of their luggages are thrown away, fall away, and then some of the people also, we have a problem of those whom luggages are not yet brought. Because the luggages are being stored in Khartoum airport and they are selling it bit by bit. That is why we are getting challenges. But we are doing our level best for every. Come and check the number.
Returnees at the site were provided with 3 meals a day by a cross. The decision was taken to distribute cooked food during the entire airlifting operation. This was decided to reduce the fire risks at the site, to allow returnees arriving late enough time to rest, unpack, and then settle in their respective accommodation, and to limit the discrepancies between the first arrivals and the later arrivals. Returnees were complaining that the food was raw and that it was making some of them sick. Camp management requested that the chiefs discuss with the community. A solution was reached. The returnees wanted members of their own community to prepare and cook the food. After this, few complaints came in. The distribution of food was also challenging. One member of each household had to go to the kitchen 3 times a day to collect food. Staff had to control the queues, as sometimes there could be over 1,000 people queuing for food.
Basically, it's important to create the lines so that we get to know who exactly has served and who has not served. And then secondly, it's because some of the people, like the elderly person, they felt they cannot line up with the children because they are already grown up. And then that's why we have to separate them, to make them in a different lines. Yeah, the main complaint from the returnees is that normally they tend to say, why is it that they are fed on one type of food? And that's the one that's only provided for us. So
the issue was raised with the World Food Programme. However, they explained that these were the emergency rations according to the WFP African Standard Rations. There were a number of partners concerned with water and sanitation at the site. The coordination between health and wash partners was important to avoid an outbreak of cholera or diarrhea.
On the site there were already boreholes available, but it was not enough to produce enough water for the 6,000 refugees that were here at the same time. So we also had to truck in water. And so more than 10 trucks per day water came in, and we had to distribute that kind of water. We had to make sure that the water was drinkable, and so we chlorinated them at the entrance of the camp. So there was only chlorinated water in the camp. And we looked at medical information to make sure that, that we were providing the right quality of water. And we also did some water quality testing. In the beginning it was very hectic. Returnees already arrived when the toilet blocks still needed to be built. So it had to go very fast. In the beginning we were digging the trenches by hand, but that was too slow, so we got in an excavator, and then the building picked up space very much.
Another challenge involved partners that were not on site regularly. After failing to attend the daily coordination meetings, camp management had to approach the WASH cluster of South Sudan and request members to provide technical assistance to partners that were not meeting the standards in order to be able to improve the response. With the arrival of the first wave of returnees, IOM's implementing partner, International Medical Corps, began providing health assistance to the returnees as well as the surrounding population in Kapuri.
This one is given to the outside community, the host community, because they also come to the site to seek medical treatment. So when they come, we issue them with health pass.
The clinic was open 7 days a week from 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. and provided basic primary healthcare services, including treatment for a range of illnesses, the most common being respiratory infections, fever, watery diarrhea, and malaria.
We have 2 tents now. In the first tent we have registration service, because sometimes we need to know exactly how many patients we receive a day and which kind of disease we receive. Because if there is an emergency or if there is an epidemic, we should discuss about that cases to see how we can manage some situations. We have 4 consultation rooms and one lab where we do some emergency exam like rapid malaria tests.
Over the course of 2.5 months, IMC conducted over 12,000 consultations, and at the height of the emergency operation, the clinic saw more than 300 patients per day. It quickly became apparent that the number of people in need of healthcare was far greater than the number of health actors. Extra hands were needed, especially to care for the growing number of children and pregnant women at the transit site. The health and WASH partners on site worked together to address rising malaria infections through increasing the number of and visibility of health and hygiene promoters on site. Health promoters were introduced to the community with the help and support of the chiefs. During the first 2 days at the site, there was no security, there was no control of who was entering the site, no way of ensuring the safety of the returnees, no way of securing the equipment, and no way of ensuring the safety of the humanitarian workers and volunteers that were present at the site throughout the day. Until sufficient lighting was set up, security was required to patrol the perimeter of the property and the food stores. Camp management wanted to encourage returnees to make contact with extended family members in Juba, and so while there was a gate control system, visitors and host community members were allowed full access to the site. Camp management decided to hire private security and policemen to secure the site. The policemen demanded benefits of food, shelter and water before committing to remain at the site. The security guards checked those entering the site for illicit substances such as drugs and alcohol. They also worked closely with IOM to ensure that all those entering and leaving the site were tracked by registration teams. Following several incidences, alcohol was banned. Protection partners offer a range of services at the site. Some of the activities include identifying separated or unaccompanied children, Protection partners are also working to determine the final destination of the children who have been separated from their parents and caretakers. South Sudan Older People's Organization joined partners to work to assist the elderly returnees who are in need of assistance.
The daily coordination meetings have been really helpful in identifying what each organization is doing, the needs that they're meeting, and where gaps exist.
When we came in, the protection cluster had already done an assessment. One of the important things that came out related to child protection is that there was no activity at all for children nor for youth, and that the children and the youth were just hanging around the tents. When we came in, we decided to create some structure in the activities with the children. One of the aims of a child-friendly space is to bring children together and to create a safe environment for them. One of the first steps to do is to think about, okay, how can we organize the children? What kind of activities do we want to do with them? And who will facilitate them? One of the things that Street Children Aid and War Child did is think of a structure. So we decided to group the children in age groups. So we have an age group for children from 1 to 6, another one 7 to 12, a group 13 to 17, and then the youth. The youth would just take over the football field, which made it really difficult to children to create a safe playing field for them as well.
So we're within TTI, the Teachers Training Institute, and there are several permanent structures, many of them multi-level. The kids would love to sprint up and down the stairs as fast as they could, run along the second stories, and so it was kind of a protection concern that was raised within the coordination meeting, and so IOM and UNHCR were helpful enough to block off the stairs so that the children can't run up, and it doesn't require our presence for the time that we're within the site each day. There are lots of international organizations working here, and lots of cars coming through the site all of the time. So there are pretty much always children on the roads running back and forth, and kind of making sure that an accident doesn't happen involving a child in a car has also been an issue that we faced for the time that we've been here. When we do our rounds each day, or several times per day, we stop and speak with children who are running or playing in the street and say, this is not safe, you should either step off to the side or in your tent or come to the child-friendly space. And they sit there attentively and listen, but oftentimes you turn your back and walk 10 steps and turn around and they're back to playing in the street again.
Communities across South Sudan are absorbing tens of thousands of returnees every year. This year alone, over 115,000 people have returned to the country. It was important to establish a good working relationship with the community in and around the transit site. Within a few days, a market had formed outside the gates of the transit site, where traders had come to sell tea, coffee, vegetables, and meat. Some teachers and government workers live on the property, and there were complaints that the returnees were using their property, trampling their crops, and breaking facilities. Camp managers sat down with the residents of the property and agreed to fence off their houses and agricultural land.
Because children go even to the veranda there, and they go to the toilets. And this is why we put it like that, but it is not, the door here is open. So they come in, but it has decreased. We wanted this one to be locked, but as soon as they are going, there is no much problem. But also the structures here, like some which may remain, will help us for teaching practice and so on. So this place is now developing. You have seen the market outside there. This was a bush, so it is now getting into town.
This is not a permanent camp. This is a transit site, which of course gives us all a sort of deadline that all agencies and all stakeholders here are having in their mind. Of course, it is not something like a fixed deadline, but we all know that this location here has to be returned back to his origin purposes, which is a school. So therefore, we are all trying and giving our best, including the community, to try to preserve and not to damage the facilities which were here built.
IOM provides onward transportation assistance, OTA, to returnees to South Sudan who are unable to return to their homes due to a lack of transport options or a lack of resources. In the past year, IOM has provided OTA to over 48,000 people. Upon arrival at the site, returnees were registered, and during the process they indicated their final intended destination. Chiefs were responsible for registering people for OTA. Once the chiefs had collected enough names, then a convoy was organized. IOM provided OTA to over 5,350 returnees from this site. Medical screening was conducted less than 72 hours before departure. IOM assigned megaphones to the traditional chiefs who walked around the camp spreading key messages including where and how to register for OTA. During the boarding of the first convoy, there was little crowd control and no shade, so some returnees complained of feeling ill in the sun. IOM hired casual labourers from the site to construct a boarding gate for following departures, which included a shaded area. This resulted in more organised and faster boarding of the buses. The record for boarding of a bus was 8 minutes. Three verification exercises were conducted to determine the actual population living at the transit site. It was necessary to conduct the verifications just after sunrise before security opened the gates to the host community. Enumerators were selected from outside the transit site and were provided with 3 hours of training.
We give them bracelets with VRF numbers. The numbers in the bracelet will always correspond to the numbers in their voluntary return form.
During the verification, staff were presented with a number of challenges. In some cases, they struggled to communicate with returnees. There were a number of unaccompanied, extremely vulnerable elderly women, one of whom could no longer speak, so IOM referred this case to protection partners. And in a few cases, members of the extended family had travelled to meet with their relatives and were now living at the site, however they did not have VRF forms. In these cases, new VRF forms had to be issued. IOM teams made note of cases of concern and passed the information to protection partners and partners involved with food distribution in order to close the gaps in assistance. The data collected from the verification exercises was processed quickly and presented to partners to guide interventions at the site. With a wide range of stakeholders and service providers involved in the life of a site, camp management focuses on developing effective coordination mechanisms that support the provision of assistance and protection. During the first days of the site, camp management identified that there was no channel for consultation with the returnees on site. At the first coordination meeting, partners were asked to identify a type of hierarchy within the community in order to set up channels for communication.
If the agencies or the site management needs to communicate with the returnees, we do it through the chiefs, who then pass on the message to the returnees. It has been very useful and very important to work with the chiefs. It has been very effective because the returnees recognize the chiefs as authority figures.
هنا طبعا لو في مشكلة داخل الكميني في مشاكل هنا بيصلوا هنا ذاته ما بدي مرات هنا ما بدي في البوليس هنا بوقت تحت مع مواطن في المشاكل هنا نحلوا هنا غادي أنا ما في مشاكل يعني الناس كل بيسمع كلام سلطان إلا سلطان زول يعني ما عنده زكاة في الراس لكن زول عنده زكاة في الراس أنا بأقنع مواطن وكلام كله ما بوصله للبوليس ولا خلنا ننتهي كلام ده غادي هنا وصلوا في مشاكل لكن أنا بحاول ننتهي.
Protection partners were tasked with providing information to returnees on services available at the site. NRC set up an information point where returnees could meet with staff and ask questions regarding OTA, health services and land allocation. Humanitarian partners on site have worked closely with the government to provide humanitarian assistance to the returnees. IOM, UNHCR and the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs and Disaster Management have managed the site since it opened. Camp managers organised daily coordination meetings in the first few weeks to ensure that partners were fully informed and able to communicate concerns to the group. Camp management used the daily coordination meetings to promote cooperation, integration, and encourage activities that would result in a sustainable relationship between camp residents and host populations.
And it is one of the best coordination where you get people coming together from different backgrounds and different cultures, but they work in a team as one body, as one people, and they understand themselves quickly to solve some of the problems which sometimes happen.
One of the challenges has been trying to identify and decide on an exit strategy without clear information as to when the site must close and what will happen to those returnees remaining at the site who have indicated that Juba is their final destination. Camp management has been committed to advocating for safe, dignified and voluntary return and to local integration for returnees wishing to remain in Juba.
So I'm not quite sure. It started several weeks ago. Maybe it's this new beard that I have, but have received 4 marriage proposals from women within the site, so there were 3 in 3 days, and then a couple-day break, and then a 4th, and the 4th was by far the most insistent. She asked if I was married, didn't see a ring on my finger, and I said no, that I'm not married, and then she said, well then you have to marry me. Well, thank you for the offer. It was wonderful to meet you. I don't know that I can agree to that at this point.
West.